In July 2026, Meta announced that its Louisiana AI campus would expand to 5 gigawatts of compute capacity across nearly 10 million square feet. The power plan behind that announcement included 7 new natural gas plants, 3 grid batteries, nuclear uprates, purchased power, and more transmission. Entergy's public application gave the proposed gas fleet a nameplate capacity of 5,278 megawatts. Those numbers sound almost identical. They are not. 5 gigawatts describes the computing campus Meta wants to build. 5,278 megawatts describes 7 utility power plants Entergy wants regulators to approve. Meta says it will pay the full cost of the energy, water, and infrastructure it uses. Entergy says a 20-year service agreement would protect other customers. The machinery can operate for decades, while Meta's financing announcement describes initial building leases of 4 years with extension options. Different contracts run on different clocks. The unanswered issue is whether the payment protections last as long as the assets. If a private AI campus pays for a public utility power system, what keeps the cost from outliving the customer? To answer it, we need to separate the plants already approved from the plants still proposed, then follow the money from a server hall to a gas turbine and back to a household bill. Meta began construction in Richland Parish in December 2024. The original public announcement described a $10 billion project, about 4 million square feet, and more than 500 direct jobs. The site was a 2,250-acre former agricultural property near Holly Ridge. By July 2026, the announced scope had changed. Meta described more than $50 billion of investment in the region, nearly 10 million square feet, 5 gigawatts of compute capacity, and more than 1,000 operating roles once built out. These are company and state projections, not completed outcomes. They show why the electrical system grew so quickly. At 5 gigawatts, the campus would need the kind of substations, transmission paths, protection, and firm generation normally planned as a power system. If it reached that scale and ran continuously, demand would be comparable to the output of several large generating stations. The campus itself is also being financed differently from a traditional owner-occupied factory. In October 2025, Meta announced a joint venture with funds managed by Blue Owl Capital. Those funds would own 80%, Meta would own 20%, manage construction and property operations, and lease the completed facilities. Meta said the initial operating leases would run 4 years with extension options. It also provided a capped residual value guarantee for the first 16 years of operations. That structure gives Meta flexibility and brings outside capital into the campus. The 4-year initial lease does not predict an exit, but it does put the building ownership and utility commitment on different timelines. The plants would last longer still. The power plant centers on a combined cycle combustion turbine, or CCCT. Its long physical life is what makes the contract question important. Natural gas enters a combustion turbine, compressed air mixes with the fuel, and burns. The hot, expanding gas spins a turbine connected to a generator. That is the first power cycle. The exhaust is still extremely hot. Instead of throwing that heat away, a heat recovery steam generator uses it to boil water. Steam then drives a second turbine and generator. That is the second cycle. Combining the two produces more electricity from the same fuel than a simple cycle gas turbine. It also makes the plant larger and more complex. The site needs gas supply, water and steam systems, cooling, emissions controls, transformers, switchyards, and a high voltage route to the grid. These plants can provide firm power and respond to system needs, but they are not temporary equipment for one construction phase. A utility builds them as long-lived system assets. Their cost includes construction, financing, maintenance, fuel, pipelines or gas delivery, and eventual retirement. Each proposed block combines 1 gas turbine, 1 heat recovery steam generator, and 1 steam turbine train. Real output changes with weather, equipment condition, and plant operation. The site also depends on continuous gas delivery and a cooling system that condenses exhaust steam back into water. A disruption outside the fence can therefore limit machines that appear independent on a capacity table. Construction locks those systems together. Foundations and turbine halls are designed for specific machines. A 500 kilovolt switchyard is sized for regional power flows. The asset can serve another customer, but it cannot be folded up and moved when a contract changes. That permanence arrives in stages. The utility orders long lead equipment and builds fixed gas and transmission connections before a turbine earns revenue. After foundations, switchyards, and major equipment are installed, the investment needs another useful system role, or a customer payment, if the original demand never arrives. Quarterly cost and schedule reports matter before the customer takes full power. The payment question reaches beyond the data center fence. Even if the customer covers every direct interconnection asset, a utility plant can serve the wider grid. The plant could lower other generation costs, but it could also remain in the rate base if the original customer changes course. Louisiana's first Meta Power Package tested that arrangement at a smaller, though still enormous scale. In 2025, Entergy Louisiana asked the Public Service Commission to approve generation and transmission for the first Richland Parish project, called Laidley in the regulatory record. The commission accepted a settlement after a 4-1 vote in August. Order U37425 became effective on August 29, 2025. The approved generation consisted of three 754 megawatt combined cycle units, totaling 2,262 megawatts of nameplate capacity. Two Franklin Farms units were planned near the data center site in Richland Parish. The third was planned at Entergy's Waterford site in St. Charles Parish near Kelowna. The approved North Louisiana transmission project included a roughly 60-mile 500 kilovolt line from Mount Olive to Sarepta, with major endpoint upgrades. Separate customer-paid and point-of-delivery facilities served the connection itself. The settlement also created a path to procure or designate up to 1,500 megawatts of solar or hybrid resources to Laidley. That was an authorization and process, not proof that 1,500 megawatts was already built or operating. The order included genuine protections. Entergy must provide quarterly construction reporting. It has to notify the commission when costs or commercial operation dates exceed assumptions. Construction costs remain subject to prudence review. The company has obligations involving parental guarantees, collateral, early termination fees, and material changes to the agreements. But the commission also stated what it was not doing. It accepted the settlement without approving the electric service agreement and related commercial agreements themselves. It retained authority to review whether utility actions and costs were prudent. The regulator approved the plans and conditions, while the confidential commercial assumptions remained outside that finding. Utility accounting begins with the revenue requirement. A regulated utility spends money to build and operate assets, then seeks to recover allowed costs, depreciation, taxes, and a return through rates. For an ordinary power plant, those costs are spread across the customers the plant serves. For a facility built mainly because one enormous customer arrived, that default creates a risk. If the customer uses less power than forecast or leaves early, the utility still owns the plant and still has financing and operating costs. The risk unfolds over time. During construction, the utility commits capital before the plant earns revenue. Once the asset enters service, regulators usually allow the approved investment to be depreciated over many years. Customers pay a portion of the asset cost each year, along with financing and operating expenses. If the new customer pays a minimum charge large enough to cover that annual requirement, existing customers are protected during the contract. If the charge starts too late, follows usage too closely, or ends before enough of the asset is paid down, a gap can remain. There is also a difference between a plant being useful and a plant being economic. A generator abandoned by its original customer might still produce electricity for the grid. But if its cost is higher than alternatives, if gas prices rise, or if the system already has enough capacity, usefulness does not guarantee full value. The unrecovered portion is the stranded cost regulators are trying to prevent. This is why a simple statement that Meta pays for its own substation is not enough. The direct connection may be fully customer funded, while generation and network assets follow utility accounting. Protection has to match the full cost path. The service agreement is supposed to move that risk back toward the customer. In the 2026 expansion filing, Entergy says eVest, the Meta-related customer for the second campus, would pay minimum monthly charges under a 20-year agreement. Entergy says those payments would fully offset the revenue requirement for the proposed generators, batteries, certain transmission improvements, and service costs during the original term. The filing also describes a Meta guarantee, other collateral and credit products, early termination cost recovery, 36 months advance notice for non-renewal, and a process to retain or sell combined cycle units if the customer exits. The minimum bill and termination charge are intended to address unpaid plant costs. Collateral and the parent guarantee give Entergy another route to payment if the customer fails to perform. The unresolved issue is adequacy. Key commercial terms, selected load figures, costs, battery details, and calculations are redacted from the public version. The public can see the categories of protection without independently testing every amount or scenario. That is not evidence that the protections are weak. It is a limit on what can be claimed about them. Entergy filed the second application in March 2026 under Louisiana's Lightning Initiative. The customer is identified as eVest, planning a second hyperscale data center adjacent to the first. The 2026 filing is a separate proposal. Entergy seeks approval for 7 additional 754 megawatt combined cycle plants, totaling 5,278 megawatts of nameplate capacity. 4 would be near the eVest campus in Richland Parish. 3 would be near the existing Big Cajun site in Point Coupé Parish. The application also includes 3 battery storage facilities. The public testimony identifies 2 200-megawatt projects, Bogalusa West Solar in Washington Parish and Cypress Harvest Solar in Iberville Parish. The public record reviewed here does not disclose enough to state a complete battery total or duration. The major transmission proposal is a 150-mile, 500-kilovolt line running from West Fork Creek in Richland Parish to St. Landry Parish, plus a new 500-kilovolt switching station. Other customer-funded interconnection work is described separately. The 500-kilovolt line would connect regional grid areas rather than simply feed the campus. Higher voltage allows large amounts of power to move at lower current for the same transfer, reducing losses and conductor requirements. Generation near Richland Parish or Big Cajun could support the wider network, and the campus could draw through more than one path. The route also creates consequences far beyond the property line. It requires a corridor, structures, substations, protection, land rights, construction access, and coordination with the existing grid. A switching station can redirect power and isolate faults without serving as a neighborhood distribution substation. This is part of the project's resilience case. A 5-gigawatt campus cannot depend on one plant or one line. It is also part of the public exposure. Transmission built for one load becomes a regional asset whose cost and use continue across many operating conditions. As of July 17, 2026, docket U37882 was open. The Commission had issued a procedural order establishing an evidentiary process and a December 16th consideration date. That procedural vote did not approve the 7 generators, the batteries, the line, cost recovery, or eligibility under the Lightning Initiative. That status is the second essential distinction. Louisiana had approved 3 plants for the first package. It had not approved 7 more for the expansion by the research cutoff. Meta's 5-gigawatt figure describes compute capacity. Entergy's 5,278 megawatts describes generator nameplate. A one-to-one comparison is tempting and wrong. A data center's actual grid demand changes with construction phases, server installation, utilization, cooling load, maintenance, and internal electrical losses. Compute capacity is a company description of the campus scale, not a public hourly meter trace. A power plant's nameplate is also not a promise of continuous output. Units have maintenance outages, hot weather can affect performance, fuel and transmission constraints matter. Batteries store electricity rather than create it, and their usefulness depends on both megawatts and duration. The system needs reserves because generation can fail and demand can vary. It also shares resources through MISO, the regional grid operator. Entergy asks for the proposed plants and batteries to be treated as system resources offered and committed through MISO's economic dispatch, subject to availability and system operation. That means these plants would not sit electrically isolated behind Meta's fence. They would be part of the utility system, potentially serving broader needs while Meta draws from the grid. On the physical grid, all generators and loads balance together. Contracts and meters decide who pays. MISO commits generators around forecasts, limits, transmission constraints, cost, and reliability. A unit near the campus may run for Meta, replace an unavailable generator, or serve broader system needs. At another hour, resources elsewhere can support the campus. The requested system treatment would let the utility use the plants for more than one customer. Entergy argues that this could improve reliability and reduce costs if the facilities are approved, built, and dispatched as assumed. It also means customer protection cannot be measured only by whether a particular turbine's output equals a particular server hall's demand. The regulator must track the customer's contractual contribution to the whole portfolio and the residual value the system receives. That shared operation is part of Entergy's benefit case. The company says efficient units could displace more expensive generation, the stronger network could improve transfers, and Meta's payments could contribute to costs otherwise carried by existing customers. Those outcomes remain projections for an unapproved build. It also reinforces the long-term risk question. Once assets are integrated into the system, the regulator has to decide what happens to them if the customer's demand, contract, or ownership changes. Entergy projects about $2.67 billion in benefits to other customers over the 20-year service agreement. The public filing describes contributions toward embedded costs, storm and resilience costs, and programs for low-income assistance, efficiency, and weatherization. Meta made a separate savings claim in July, more than $2 billion from the expansion agreement, on top of $650 million from the first agreement. The public materials reviewed here do not reconcile that scope with Entergy's $2.67 billion benefit projection. These are projections. Customers have not already received 20 years of savings. The basic mechanism is plausible. Utilities have fixed costs for existing generation, transmission, storm recovery, and service. A very large new customer paying charges above its incremental cost can spread those fixed costs over more sales and reduce pressure on everyone else. The result depends on assumptions. How fast does the campus ramp? What minimum bill applies before full operation? Which fuel and operating costs are passed through? What happens during outages or curtailment? How much new infrastructure is assigned directly to the customer? What value do the plants have if the contract ends? Because important inputs are confidential, the public benefit estimate cannot be independently reconstructed from the redacted filing alone. Regulators and interveners with protected access may see more. Viewers should still hear the correct status, projected by Entergy and Meta, under review, not guaranteed savings already delivered. Savings depend on a baseline for what other customers would have paid without the project. Fuel prices, construction costs, the campus ramp, and replacement generation can change that comparison. Regulators need to test those assumptions, keep the protections enforceable under adverse scenarios, and compare actual results with the forecast. The most striking timeline comparison comes from two different agreements. Meta says its operating leases with the Blue Owl joint venture have 4-year initial terms with options to extend. Entergy describes a 20-year electric service agreement with eVest. A combined cycle plant may operate longer than either. These terms do not automatically conflict. Meta can renew the leases, and the service customer can have obligations independent of a building lease. The filing describes guarantees, collateral, and termination provisions as safeguards intended to address the different timelines. Their adequacy cannot be tested from the public redacted record and remains unresolved for the expansion. Advocacy groups have argued that the financing creates a stranded cost risk if the project changes. That is an allegation, not a commission finding. Meta's disclosure confirms the ownership and lease structure, but does not prove the utility protections fail. The useful question is narrower. Does the public record show who pays in each exit scenario? If construction stops before a plant is complete, which committed costs are covered? If the campus ramps slowly, does the minimum bill begin early enough? If the customer exits during the 20-year term, does the guarantee cover the unpaid balance? If it chooses not to renew after 20 years, can the utility use or sell the plants without shifting unreasonable costs to existing customers? Prudence review, collateral, notice, and retain or sell provisions are intended to address those exit cases. The public record shows the categories, while important amounts and their adequacy remain partly behind redactions and, for the second package, before the commission. The proposed supply is broader than 7 gas plants, but the categories are not interchangeable. Entergy's filing describes a sustainability agreement contemplating 2,500 megawatts of solar, onshore wind, hybrid, or other renewable resources. It also discusses support for a Waterford 3 nuclear uprate and potentially a River Bend uprate. Entergy says those nuclear uprates are not being certified in this docket. Solar can provide large amounts of energy during daylight. Batteries can move some of that energy into later hours and respond quickly to grid conditions. Nuclear uprates can add firm carbon-free output if separately approved and completed. The combined cycle plants provide dispatchable power over long periods while exposing the system to natural gas prices and emissions. At the April 2026 Commission meeting, the Alliance for Affordable Energy asked for more independent scrutiny of the scale, gas exposure, and confidential record. Entergy answered that the procedural action approved nothing and that the company still had to prove its case. The dispute remains open. Keeping the cost with the customer requires more than the public promise. The 2025 order imposed construction monitoring and prudence review. For the 2026 expansion, Entergy describes minimum monthly charges, guarantees, collateral, termination payments, advance notice, and a plan for assets that remain after the contract. Those proposed protections have not yet received a merits decision. Louisiana's 2025 order put some of those layers around 3 approved combined cycle plants totaling 2,262 megawatts. The Commission kept authority over prudence and did not approve every commercial agreement itself. The 2026 expansion asks the same question at a much larger scale. 7 proposed plants totaling 5,278 megawatts, 3 batteries, and a 150-mile transmission line for a campus Meta says will reach 5 gigawatts of compute. Entergy and Meta say the customer will cover the costs and create billions in benefits. The public filing describes proposed protection mechanisms, but it leaves key values confidential, and the merits had not been decided by the research cutoff. Private financing can reduce public exposure, but the protections still have to survive a change in demand, ownership, or contract status. Before construction, the Commission still needs to establish who carries the costs if demand arrives late or the customer exits, and what happens to the plants when the 20-year service term ends. Quarterly reports can test construction cost and schedule. Later reviews can compare customer payments with the promised coverage, examine whether the utility enforced its safeguards, and account for any broader system value. If those answers hold, Louisiana may gain a new power system financed by its largest customer. If they do not, the infrastructure will still be standing long after the business plan that justified it has changed. The expansion decision remains open. Louisiana can still test the promises against the machinery, the contracts, and the exit cases before 7 proposed plants become operating utility assets.